Look at him. That ragged old man's a disgrace to the uniform. The voice echoed across the Liberty Cafe, loud enough for every patron to hear. Samuel Brooks didn't respond. He just straightened his faded green coat, lowered his gaze, and wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Quiet, unnoticed, as if the weight of his past was his alone to carry. Days later, at the Veterans Day ceremony, he seemed invisible as he sat in the last row. But then, the four-star general stopped mid-speech. His eyes found Samuel, and slowly he raised his hand in a salute that froze the entire crowd. One by one, the town rose, saluting the man they had overlooked for years. This is the story of Samuel Brooks, the hero no one saw coming. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, Cumberland Hollow is the kind of small Tennessee town where time seems to slow down just enough for folks to remember what really matters. With a population barely brushing 1-200, it's a place where everyone knows your name, your father's name, and probably your grandfather's too. The streets are lined with maples and oaks that blaze crimson and gold in autumn, casting long shadows across whitewashed porches and neat yards. The air smells of fresh-cut wood, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of cornbread cooling on kitchen windowsills. Life here isn't rushed. It moves to the rhythm of church bells, the low hum of tractors, and the laughter of children chasing stray dogs down Main Street. Right at the heart of town stands the Liberty Cafe, a two-story brick building with big front windows that catch the morning sun and bathe the tables inside in a golden glow. Opened in 1948, just as soldiers were returning from World War II, it quickly became more than a place to grab a bite. It became a second home for generations of veterans, farmers, and mill workers. Its walls are lined with black and white photos of young men in uniform, smiling with the hope of youth, many of whom never came back from distant battlefields. There's a faded flag framed behind the counter, its edges frayed, its stars and stripes dulled by time, but never by pride. The booths are worn smooth from decades of conversations, of joy, sorrow, and everything in between. Behind the counter is Martha, the soul of the Liberty Cafe. At 62, she's been pouring coffee and serving up kindness for 35 years, wearing the same warm smile that made her a friend to every lonely heart who walked through the door. Her hair, once dark, is streaked with silver now, always pulled back in a loose bun. Martha knows her customers the way a mother knows her children. She remembers who likes their eggs over easy, who can't have salt, who always orders 2 pieces of toast but only eats 1. But most of all, she knows Samuel Brooks. She's watched him walk in at precisely 7:15 every morning for as long as she can remember. Samuel's arrival is as steady as the sunrise. He steps through the door with quiet purpose, the bell above jingling softly. His frame is lean now, age having worn away the muscle that once filled out his uniform. His olive green army coat hangs a little loose on his shoulders, its fabric faded from years of wear and washing. The left sleeve bears a patch, its stitching frayed, its colors muted. But Samuel wears it with the same care as he would a medal. He always picks the same booth by the window, where the morning light spills across the table like a blessing. With slow, deliberate hands, he removes his coat, folds it neatly, and places it beside him. From his pocket comes an old gold pocket watch, the kind passed down through generations. He sets it on the table, opens it, and glances at the time, as if to remind himself that today, like every day, is a gift. Next comes the newspaper, a local edition, edges soft and yellowed from use. Samuel unfolds it carefully, smoothing it out on the table, though he rarely seems to read past the headlines. A white ceramic mug of black coffee appears before him, placed there by Martha without a word. She knows he doesn't need to ask. She knows he doesn't take sugar, doesn't take cream, and Samuel, in return, offers her a small nod, a silent thank you between old friends. He sits there, cradling the warm mug between his weathered hands, staring out the window at a town that's changed and yet stayed the same. And for a little while at least, the weight of his past rests quietly at his side. Samuel Brooks was born in 1932 in a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The air in those hills was clean, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine and earth. Life was hard, but folks in Cumberland Hollow knew nothing else and didn't ask for more. His father, Henry Brooks, was a World War I veteran who came home from the trenches of France with a limp and a quiet strength that shaped Samuel's childhood. Henry taught his son that a man's word was his bond, and honor wasn't something you wore. It was something you lived. Samuel learned early about work, chopping firewood before sunrise and tending the family's small garden after school. From the time he could walk, Samuel roamed the hills, climbing trees, fishing the creeks, and listening to the old stories his father would tell on winter nights. His mother, Ruth, taught him to read from a Bible so worn the pages were soft as cloth. She kept a neat home and hummed hymns as she cooked cornbread and beans. Samuel didn't have much in the way of toys, but he had imagination, and he had love, and in those hills that was enough. When Samuel turned 18 in 1950, he made a choice that surprised no one. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The world beyond Cumberland Hollow had called to him for years, and when war broke out in Korea, he knew where he belonged. He kissed his mother's cheek, shook his father's hand like a man, and left for Paris Island, where the mountains of Tennessee were replaced by sand and salt air. Korea was a cold hell. Samuel fought at the Chosin Reservoir, where winter winds cut like razors and frostbite claimed men as surely as bullets did. He carried wounded comrades on his back, shared his last rations, and stood watch through endless nights while the enemy lurked in the shadows. He wasn't one for speeches or bravado, but his men trusted him, and that meant everything. More than once he was recognized for his courage. Though he quietly turned down medals he felt belonged to others who hadn't come home. When the Korean War ended, Samuel stayed in the Corps, serving in special units during the early Cold War. His assignments were the kind folks didn't read about in newspapers. He moved through foreign cities unnoticed, gathering intelligence, helping to keep dangers at bay before they reached American shores. He saw parts of the world most would never know, but his heart never left Tennessee. After 20 years of service, Samuel returned home. He married Evelyn, a childhood friend who'd waited for him, and together they built a simple life. Evelyn was a school teacher, beloved by her students, and known for her gentle spirit. The two shared dreams of growing old together, tending their garden, and perhaps welcoming grandchildren. But those dreams were cut short when Evelyn fell ill. Samuel became her rock, caring for her through every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, until the day he had to say goodbye. In the quiet years that followed, Samuel kept to himself, but not out of bitterness. He found purpose in caring for the veterans' cemetery and memorial at the edge of town. He came at dawn, mowing grass, cleaning headstone, setting fresh flowers, all at his own expense. No one asked him to do it. He didn't want thanks. For Samuel, it was about duty, to the friends he'd lost, to the men who never came home, to the ideals he still held dear. He lived humbly, wearing the same faded green coat every day, not because he couldn't afford another, but because it reminded him of who he was and who he served beside. And though many in Cumberland Hollow overlooked the quiet man who kept to the shadows, Samuel Brooks carried the heart of a hero, one silent act of devotion at a time. Clinton Hayes came to Cumberland Hollow with the kind of presence that filled a room before he even opened his mouth. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always dressed sharp as a tack, Clinton made sure folks noticed him. His boots were polished until they gleamed, his blazer pressed crisp with a pin on the lapel, denoting his years in military service. But those who looked a little closer, those who listened, soon learned that Clinton's uniform wasn't about pride in service. It was about pride in himself. Clinton had spent 2 decades in the Army, but his assignments had little to do with the front lines or battlefields. He worked in logistics, overseeing supply chains, inventories, and transportation schedules. Important work, no doubt, but Clinton told his stories as if he'd led men through gunfire and storms. When I was at Fort Bragg, he'd begin, his voice booming through Liberty Cafe, we ran an operation that would have fallen apart without my planning. Or, back in '87, my decisions kept an entire division fed through the worst winter in memory. He'd pull out laminated certificates from his briefcase, the one he carried everywhere, and show them off to whoever would look. Outstanding service in procurement. Excellence in administrative coordination. He treated these as if they were medals of honor. He kept photos in his wallet of himself, shaking hands with generals and colonels, always slipping them out at opportune moments to impress. And while no one ever dared challenge his claims outright, the glances exchanged among the other veterans at Liberty Cafe spoke volumes. Where Samuel Brooks was quiet and steady, Clinton was loud and restless. Samuel came in the same time every morning, ordered the same simple meal, and sat with the same peaceful presence as the sunrise. Clinton barged in, making sure to greet everyone, his voice echoing, his stories ready. Samuel folded his coat carefully on his seat. Clinton draped his blazer over a chair as if to mark his territory. Samuel's eyes were soft, observing, listening. Clinton's eyes scanned the room for attention, for validation. It wasn't long before Clinton took issue with Samuel. At first it was subtle. He glanced at Samuel's worn army coat, then at his own polished attire, and smirk. "Some of us still take pride in how we represent our service," he'd mutter, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Later he became bolder, tossing jabs across the cafe. "That coat of his looks like something the dog dragged in," he'd chuckle. "Imagine calling yourself a veteran and showing up looking like that." What truly irked Clinton wasn't Samuel's appearance. It was Samuel's silence. The older man's refusal to defend himself, to rise to Clinton's baiting, made Clinton feel invisible, and Clinton Hayes hated to be invisible. His words bounced off Samuel as though they never landed. That infuriated him all the more. Where Clinton craved applause for every little deed, Samuel carried the weight of a lifetime of service without needing anyone's approval. Clinton filled the cafe with his voice. Samuel filled it with his dignity. And in that quiet, in that unshakable calm, Clinton saw something he couldn't understand, and that frightened him far more than he'd ever admit. So he kept needling, kept trying to show the town that Samuel Brooks was no hero. That ragged coat, that quiet nature, surely it hid something shameful. But what Clinton failed to see was that every word he spoke, every cruel remark, only deepened the respect others quietly felt for the man who bore it all without a word in return. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings when the air in Cumberland Hollow carried the promise of winter, and the sunlight streamed through the front windows of Liberty Cafe, casting warm patches across the worn wooden floor. The usual quiet hum filled the room, the clink of coffee cups, the soft shuffle of newspapers, and the low murmur of familiar conversation. At his usual corner table by the window sat Samuel Brooks, his faded green military coat draped carefully over the back of his chair, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. Across the room, Clinton Hayes pushed through the door with his usual flair, the cafe's bell jangling loudly at his entrance. His boots clicked against the floorboards as he strode in, his freshly pressed slacks and polished belt buckle gleaming in the morning light. A leather briefcase swung from his hand, and his voice, before he even reached the counter, was already filling the space. "Morning, Martha. The usual for your most decorated customer, if you please." Martha gave a polite smile as she poured his coffee, but her eyes flicked nervously toward Samuel. She could feel it in the air, the tension that always seemed to follow Clinton when he noticed Samuel sitting there, quiet and steady as the rising sun. Clinton grabbed his coffee, took a dramatic sip, then turned to face the cafe, his eyes locking onto Samuel. For a moment, it seemed as though he might let it pass, but Clinton couldn't help himself. The sight of that worn coat, those simple boots, and that quiet dignity, it was too much for a man who craved the spotlight. "Look at him! Can you believe that ragged old man calls himself a veteran? What a disgrace to the uniform!" Clinton's voice rang out, slicing through the cozy atmosphere like a blade. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered over plates. The cafe fell silent, except for the steady tick of the old wall clock and the hiss of the coffee machine. Martha's heart sank. She clenched the dishcloth in her hands, torn between wanting to speak up and knowing Samuel wouldn't want a scene made on his behalf. Her gaze shifted to the regulars. Mr. Jennings, the mechanic, who frowned deeply. Lillian, the retired nurse, who set down her tea with trembling hands. Even young Tom, the paperboy, stared wide-eyed at Clinton, unsure what to make of the cruelty he'd just witnessed. Samuel didn't look up. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around his coffee mug. He straightened his shoulders as though reminding himself of who he was, and slowly, deliberately, he reached for his coat. The fabric, frayed at the cuffs, hung from his frame like a memory of younger, stronger years. With practiced care, he slipped it on, buttoning it up as if preparing for a final duty. Clinton smirked, mistaking Samuel's silence for defeat. "That's right. Best to leave, old man. Let the real veterans enjoy their breakfast." But Samuel gave no response. No glare, no sharp word, no sign that Clinton's venom had touched him at all. Instead, he slid a few coins onto the table, enough for the coffee and a tip for Martha, as he did every day. He nodded once toward her, a gesture of quiet thanks, and then turned toward the door. The cafe remained still as Samuel walked out, the bell above the door giving a soft chime as it closed behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened seemed to hang in the air like a fog. Clinton, sensing perhaps too late that his attempt at bravado had only left a bitter taste in the room, cleared his throat and returned to his table. But the damage was done. The regulars of Liberty Cafe resumed their meals, but the warmth of the morning had gone with Samuel. And outside, as the leaves skittered across the sidewalk, Samuel Brooks walked on, his back straight, his gaze steady, carrying the weight of his past and the dignity that no insult could ever take from him. The morning of Veterans Day in Cumberland Hollow arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the American flags lining Main Street ripple proudly in the breeze. The whole town had gathered at the Cumberland Veterans Memorial, a modest brick monument framed by century-old oaks whose branches stretched like guardians over the small square. Bronze plaques bearing the names of local sons and daughters lost to war gleamed in the soft sunlight. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as families, school children, and aging veterans took their seats for the annual ceremony. At the front of the crowd stood General Thomas McAllister, the guest of honor that year. At 65, McAllister was a man whose presence commanded respect without a word. His silver hair peaked beneath his cap, and the chest of his dress uniform bore rows of ribbons and medals earned over a lifetime of service, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Panama. He had led troops through some of the toughest modern conflicts, and his sharp eyes, though softened by time, missed little. The mayor had just finished his opening remarks, and the local high school band was settling into position, their instruments glinting in the sunlight when McAllister approached the podium. He began to speak, his voice steady and clear, about honor, sacrifice, and the debt owed to those who served. The crowd listened, many with hands over hearts, some with misty eyes as they remembered fathers, brothers, and friends who never came home. And then, as he glanced across the assembled faces, McAllister's gaze fell on a figure seated quietly at the back, beneath the shadow of an old oak. Samuel Brooks. To most of the townsfolk, Samuel blended into the background. The faded green coat, the humble posture, the air of a man content to let others take the spotlight. But not to McAllister. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in recognition. His trained eye caught the nearly invisible patch on the left breast of Samuel's coat, a patch so worn, so faded by time and weather, that only a man who truly knew its meaning would notice. McAllister froze mid-sentence. The band members shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they had missed their cue. The townsfolk exchanged puzzled looks as the general stepped away from the podium and began walking slowly, deliberately toward the rear of the crowd. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the soft tap of McAllister's polished shoes on the stone path. When he reached Samuel, the general stopped and stood at attention. There was a long, breathless pause as the town watched, unsure what was happening. Then McAllister spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every ear in the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, seated here among us today is a man who wears the rarest of symbols, a symbol awarded not for rank or title, but for valor that goes beyond the call of duty, a man who embodies the very best of us." Samuel looked up, his expression humble and perhaps a little surprised. McAllister's eyes softened, and with deliberate precision, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. And then, as if moved by a single unspoken command, people began to rise. One by one at first, then in waves. Men, women, children, veterans, students. They stood and lifted their hands in salute, hats pressed to chests, eyes glistening with emotion. Even those too young to understand mimicked the gesture, sensing the weight of the moment. For Samuel Brooks, who had borne his service quietly and carried the memories of his fallen brothers with him every day, it was a tribute he neither sought nor expected. But in that instant, as the town he had served so faithfully finally saw him for who he was, Samuel gave a small, respectful nod. A nod that said, "Thank you," not for the recognition, but for the honor given to those he never forgot. The town square stood united in silent reverence. And for the first time in years, Samuel Brooks stood taller, not because he craved the spotlight, but because his truth had finally been seen. That night, after the Veterans Day ceremony, Clinton Hayes lay awake in his small, neatly kept house on the edge of town. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting pale patterns on the ceiling, but sleep would not come. His mind replayed the scene at the Memorial Square, over and over. The moment General McAllister saluted Samuel Brooks, the way the entire town had risen to honor a man Clinton had mocked for years. The words he himself had spoken echoed in his head now, but where they once filled him with self-importance, they now stung like a lash. "Look at him! What a disgrace to the uniform!" He had said it more times than he could count. He'd smirked, boomed his voice across the cafe, puffed himself up at Samuel's expense, and all along he'd been blind. Blind to the quiet strength, the dignity, the sacrifice of a man who never once answered insult with insult. A man who had carried the weight of real service, real valor, without ever seeking applause. Clinton shifted under the quilt, his heart heavy in his chest. He stared out the window at the dark outline of the town's oak trees, at the flag at the memorial still faintly visible under the square street lamp. And in that quiet, empty hour, he knew he couldn't leave things as they were. When morning came, Clinton rose early. He dressed with care, polished his boots, smoothed his shirt, but this time not for show. This time it was out of respect. He stepped out into the crisp dawn and made his way toward the Veterans Memorial, where he knew Samuel would be. And there he was, just as Clinton had hoped. Samuel stood alone, as he often did on those mornings, quietly tending to the place with the same devotion he showed every week. He knelt beside one of the plaques, wiping away dew, adjusting a small vase of fresh flowers. The sun's first light glinted off his worn coat and the faint threadbare patch over his heart. Clinton stopped a few yards away, suddenly unsure of how to begin. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "Samuel, I need to say something." Samuel looked up, his expression calm as always. He said nothing, just waited, giving Clinton the space to speak. "I've been wrong. About you. About everything." Clinton's voice was low, thick with emotion. "I spent years judging what I couldn't see, trying to prove I mattered by tearing someone else down. I thought I knew what service meant, but I didn't. Not really. I saw that yesterday. And I'm sorry. Truly sorry." For a moment, Samuel simply regarded him, as if weighing the sincerity of the words. Then he nodded, a small gesture of acceptance. No bitterness, no smugness, just quiet grace. Clinton took a hesitant step closer. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to help. Here, with the memorial. It's the least I can do." Samuel reached down, picked up an extra cloth, and handed it to Clinton without a word. Side by side, they worked through the morning, wiping down plaques, trimming grass along the edges of the stones, straightening the small flags that had shifted in the breeze. They didn't speak again, but they didn't need to. In that shared labor, in the silence filled only by the songs of birds and the soft brush of cloth against bronze, Clinton found a kind of peace he hadn't known before. And Samuel, as always, led not with words but by example, showing that the greatest strength is in forgiveness, and that redemption begins the moment a man chooses humility over pride. The mornings at the Cumberland Veterans Memorial took on a new rhythm after that day. Where once Samuel Brooks had worked alone, his hands steady and sure as he cleaned and tended to the plaques and photos of the fallen, now he had company. Each Saturday, just as the first rays of sunlight slipped over the rooftops of town, Clinton Hayes arrived, quiet, purposeful, stripped of the bluster that had once defined him. Side by side, the two men moved along the rows of bronze and stone. They carried with them soft cloths, brushes, and small tools. Clinton watched and learned from Samuel at first, the gentle way the older man cleaned the framed photos of young soldiers who never grew old. the care with which he wiped away the dust that gathered at the edges of their names. The photos were faded now, the faces looking out as if waiting for someone to remember them. Samuel remembered. Clinton began to as well. There was no talk of who did more or who led the way. They simply worked. The air filled not with words, but with the sound of brushes against stone, the occasional chirp of a bird, the soft rustle of leaves overhead. And in that silence, a quiet friendship grew, one built not on shared stories or loud declarations, but on shared purpose. People who passed by on morning walks sometimes stopped to watch. They saw two men, one who had always served in silence, and one learning, perhaps for the first time, that service didn't require an audience. They saw the former logistics officer on his knees, wiping the dirt from the base of a headstone, his polished boots now scuffed with grass and mud. They saw Samuel, still in his worn coat, nodding occasionally as if to say, "Yes, this is how it's done." And Clinton came to understand what had eluded him for so long. He saw that true greatness didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need medals displayed on a chest or certificates in a briefcase. It showed itself in small acts. A man who rises before dawn to tend graves not his own, who straightens a crooked flag without fanfare, who honors the dead because it is right, not because it is seen. No speeches were given between them, no grand apologies or promises. The work itself was the apology, the shared labor, the promise. Clinton's hands, once so eager to point or gesture for effect, now worked as quietly as Samuel's. He polished the plaques, scrubbed moss from the base of stones, planted fresh flowers where weeds had taken hold. In these simple tasks, he found a kind of peace he had not known in years. The townspeople noticed the change. They no longer heard Clinton's voice booming in the cafe, nor saw him flashing his photos and papers. Instead, they saw him in the early hours, sleeves rolled up, hands dirty, working beside the man he once tried to belittle. And slowly their respect for him began to grow, not because of what he said, but because of what he did. In time, the memorial gleamed as never before. But more than that, it became a symbol of quiet redemption. The two men, so different in nature, had found common ground not through arguments or explanations, but through action. And in their steady, silent partnership, they taught everyone who watched that dignity needs no voice, that true heroes do not seek applause, and that sometimes the loudest lesson is the one given without a single word. In every town, on every street, there are men and women like Samuel Brooks, heroes who live among us without fanfare or applause. They are the ones who carry the weight of sacrifice quietly, who choose service over recognition, and whose actions speak louder than any medal or certificate ever could. They may not stand at podiums or seek out praise, but they are the foundation of our communities. They remind us that true greatness is found not in words, but in deeds. Samuel's story is not just his own. It's the story of all those who give without asking, who honor the fallen, who show us, through quiet example, what it means to live with dignity and purpose. And Clinton's journey reminds us that it's never too late to see the truth, to change, and to honor what truly matters. Today, I invite you to take a moment to reflect. Who are the silent heroes in your community? The veterans, the neighbors, the friends who give of themselves without seeking anything in return? Let's not wait for ceremonies or special occasions to honor them. Let's do it every day, with kindness, with respect, and by following their example. If this story moved you, please share it. Let others be reminded of the values that bind us together: humility, service, and quiet strength. Leave a comment below and tell us about the heroes in your life. We would be honored to hear their stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing stories that matter. Together, we can help ensure that these legacies are never forgotten. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.